Welcome to the second lesson in our class on the 4 levels of motivation. This lesson is on level 1, fear of consequences.
So,
This is your least favorite level. You don't like people to motivate themselves or other people with fear of consequences except when absolutely necessary. Is that right?
That is right, and it's interesting that's true because like we said in our first lecture, God uses this level of motivation. He tells us what the consequences are. So it's important to know consequences. Actually, this is a really interesting thing. I don't like people to use consequences as in to give consequences, but I actually do frequently teach people to set consequences. To be able to say in advance,
Interesting.
if this doesn't happen, this is the consequence. So children should know what the consequence is going to be. It shouldn't just be sprung on them.
So what you're saying is you don't like it very much for people when they say, okay, my child did this thing, how shall I punish them?
Right. I don't like that at all. But if you have something that's set up, that has been set up for weeks, and children know, okay, this is what needs to be done, and if it's not done, this is what's going to happen. Then if it doesn't get done, then I would expect my clients to follow through with the consequence.
Would you say most people overuse consequences or underuse consequences?
Yes, that's exactly right. People do not appropriately set consequences so that children or employees or in whatever setting that you're in, that people are not anticipating what is coming.
So that's an underuse of
That's
consequences.
an underuse of consequences. But the overuse of consequences is when somebody messes up, we generally as a people tend to give them immediate consequences that they are not anticipating, something that they can't have anticipated because we never shared with them that this might be the outcome.
And would you say the consequences are often too great for to respond to the behavior?
Well, oftentimes the consequences are exaggerated, they're overblown, but also even more so than that, they're not related to
So people often have like a consequence that they really like to use.
right.
Like maybe they're a parent and they have decided timeout is the consequence. So the child does something that the parent doesn't approve of, that breaks the family rules in some way, and they say, okay, timeout. And they don't
Right.
think about whether timeout is a useful consequence for that particular behavior.
Correct.
For instance, timeout as a tool is especially useful for any time that you need to be removed from the situation to get in control before you can deal with what the situation is.
Right.
It's not particularly useful for just you did a thing I didn't want you to do, and now I want you to think about being sorry for it.
Right. It's not useful for that. But even the case of pulling a child out and giving him time to calm down, it's only useful if you follow through with that. And once they've calmed down, then you work through the issue. It would be a terrible consequence to say, okay, I need to remove you from where everybody else is. So now you're going to timeout, and then you're going to be in a 10-minute timeout. And at the end of the 10 minutes, just like, okay, you can go now.
What's a bad way people use fear of consequences for their own personal motivation?
That's an interesting question. I have to think about that one. Well, I think oftentimes people use the way other people perceive you as a consequence. Like for example, you'd say, I don't want people to think poorly of me, so I'm not going to do this that I want to do. Or I don't want people to think poorly of me, so I am going to do this thing that I don't want to do, but I'm going to do it because I want people to think well of me. I think that's probably the most common way that people use fear of consequences in their personal lives is that
Fear of social
is this
consequences.
fear of social consequences of being
So you might think the best thing for me to do is to get up early in the morning and go for a run. But I don't like how I look in my running clothes, and I'm afraid my neighbors are going to look out their windows and see me running, and they're going to, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even, I would say, a more, probably more common way that people use that fear of consequences. I feel like I need to go to bed early so I can get up early, so I can run. But my friends are all staying out until 12, 1, or 2. And I don't want to look like the party pooper who just goes home and goes to bed on time. And so I'm going to stay up, and that's going to prevent me from getting up and doing the exercise that I want to do.
Yeah, that's a much better example.
It's just, I just think it's a more common example. It's something that happens a lot where people are like, no, I know I should go to bed early. I know I should do, but I don't want to look like the prude, the one that's not out, partying with everybody. So I'm going to go party even though I don't actually want to. And I see that happen a lot. I actually have clients who come in to see me frequently have that problem. Where they want to set a good sleep routine, a good sleep pattern, but they don't feel like their social life allows them to do it because of the consequence of going to bed early.
So anytime you're wanting to make a positive change and you don't feel like you can because X other thing is getting in the way, is that usually a fear of consequence? It's usually the fear of what will happen if I don't do this other thing.
What will happen, or what am I going to miss out on?
It's the fear of missing out.
You frequently we make these decisions like
I guess missing out is a consequence. Fear of consequences, fear of missing out.
Yeah, I'm going to miss out on this. And what's interesting is one of the things that's really fascinating about that to me is that it's not, usually when people are doing this, it's not for the reward. It's not like I'm going to do something because I'm going to get something out of it. It really is the fear of missing out. And oftentimes they go and do the thing and they come back and they're like, I wish I hadn't have done that. I wish I'd have just gone to bed and gotten a good night's sleep. Because they aren't even actually anticipating a reward. They're just afraid that something might happen that they will miss out on.
So you could use, in your specific example you're using, you could use fear of consequences positively if the consequence you fear is being tired the next day, not being able to get up and have your exercise routine, not being on time for work or school.
Right. For fear of consequences, here's the thing you have to remember. We're all operating on fear of consequence all the time, constantly. Because remember, if you're operating at any other level, you're operating on fear of consequence as well, because there's always a consequence associated with a reward. There's always a consequence associated with love and respect. There's always a consequence associated with character. And so you're never at any point in your life are you ever going to be operating without a fear of consequence.
So how do you focus on the consequence to be afraid of that will motivate you positively versus being afraid of the consequence that is undermining your positive change?
And it's just like you said, and that was wonderful. What you have to do is you have to change the perspective of the consequence. So rather than thinking, what am I going to miss out on? You think,
what's going to
happen tomorrow when I get up in the morning? And I think there's a phrase you used earlier today that I like that comes from somebody, and I don't know who, but you'll have to tell me. But that phrase was
insufficient respect for tomorrow.
Yes, thank you. How did you know?
Because I was thinking about it too. Yeah. Often when I'm going to bed at night and I'm tired at the end of the day, and when you are tired, your ability to motivate yourself positively, your self-control is lowered. So often when I'm going to bed at night, I might think, I want to go to bed at this specific time in the morning. But when it reaches that time at night, I often have insufficient respect for tomorrow in favor of what I feel like doing at that moment, which might be reading or watching TV or.
Right. So here's the problem is you've got an immediate reward for the evening, and the reward that you would have for the morning is too far away.
Yeah.
And so you're not thinking, neither are you thinking about the consequence.
Oh, sometimes I'm thinking about it. It's just not strong enough for me to overcome my tired lack of willpower.
Well, it's not just your tired lack of willpower, it's also the immediate reward of reading another chapter of your book or the immediate reward of watching another show, right? So you have to remember your fear of consequence is weaker than the reward that you're offering yourself. And so what you have to do in order for the fear of consequence to have sufficient strength, you have to remove the reward. You have to remove the love and respect. You have to remove anything above it that's
Could
strong.
you just strengthen the consequence of the consequence you want? For instance, if the consequence of not going to bed on time is there's a natural consequence that I'm going to be tired, but I could add on a consequence that is an artificial consequence I've assigned to myself to strengthen that.
Absolutely. Like, for example, say you get up in the morning and your morning routine is I get myself a small treat in the morning. I make you a cup of hot chocolate in the morning. If you say to yourself, if I don't get up in the morning, I don't get to drink my cup of hot chocolate in the morning.
Or if I said to you, please don't make me hot chocolate tomorrow if I don't turn out my light at my bedtime.
That would be really hard because...
I'm just saying, it would be hard to assign another person
It would be
to
hard for me because I would want to make you that hot chocolate anyways.
But I'm just saying that I could assign a consequence.
Yes.
And the consequence could be I can't have the reward if I don't do the behavior tonight.
Yes, exactly. You can give yourself an artificial consequence to strengthen that level of motivation. You could also give yourself a consequence that night. If you don't say, if I don't have my light out by 10, this is what's going to happen. This is what I have to do. And you might give yourself a consequence for that night that would give it a more immediate thing. And people do this. Think about oftentimes in classes, people teach you about when you're trying to change a habit, they have you put a band on your wrist and you slap your wrist when you make a mistake with the band. You're like,
do you recommend physical consequences?
I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's a horrible idea. Like I said, physical without the emotional, it's an empty consequence. It's an empty reward. You're creating a physical bond that has nothing to bond. It's empty.
But wouldn't you say an emotional consequence just by itself can also be negative? For instance, you don't want the consequence of I beat myself up that I didn't do the thing. You don't want the consequence of when I fail to do the thing that I wanted to do, I tell myself terrible things about myself. I call myself names. I say cruel things to myself. I think that's a consequence that people use really frequently, and it's incredibly destructive.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Any consequence that is negative in nature is not good. Most consequences are not good. Being thrust down to hell is not good. We don't want. That's why we have a fear of consequences. We don't want them.
Okay, but there are some consequences you shouldn't use. You're saying
correct.
There are some that certain
you
kinds of physical consequences. You shouldn't use kind of emotional consequences. You shouldn't use name calling and insults to yourself or to others.
So the most important thing to remember, really the most important thing when you're using consequence as a motivator, is that the consequence should be directly related to the event or the situation. So if I say, for example, if I have a client who is trying to overcome a pornography addiction, which I frequently, I work with those people a lot, and they have a relapse, and then they start to beat themselves up. How is that directly related to what happened? It's not. Now, the consequence that might be directly related would be, okay, I don't get to use my computer for 3 days. Oh, okay, that's directly related because it was my computer that I used to look at pornography. So now I have to give my computer away for 3 days. I don't get access to it at all. That's a directly related to the event or the situation. That's the thing, is so often our consequences have nothing to do with the situation that we're dealing with. And how is that helpful? How is that going to remind you not to do it again? If I have a client who looks at pornography and has that relapse, and then all they're doing is beating themselves up and telling themselves how terrible they are and what a horrible person they are, how is that going to help them to stop looking at pornography? It's not.
It's interesting, but I do think people feel like they need to treat themselves unkindly when they have done something that they wish they hadn't done. And sometimes they feel like that towards their children, that they need to treat them unkindly when their child has transgressed. And I think it comes into maybe our innate sense of justice. We were talking together right before we started recording this lesson about why is it that people like giving consequences. It's what people, even though it's not the most useful way of motivating, it's what people turn to as the default. When someone says, oh, my child is having this issue, almost inevitably the first thing they say is, how should I punish them? Mm-hmm. And we have an innate human desire to inflict consequences. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting. We do because we're born with a sense of justice and this need for justice, and of course, God is a perfectly just God, but he's luckily for us, he's also a perfectly merciful God. that combination sure softens things for us.
Yeah. But we start when we're very small children by having the sense of fairness and rightness. That's not fair. Kids get that almost as soon as they can speak. Mm-hmm. And you'll have some children who are really extreme and, where they want to know how many M&Ms you've given to their sibling because they need to have an exact same number of M&Ms.
Or more. They'd be happy to have more.
But it's not fair for them to have less.
Right. But
and
it'd be
it's one of the
reasons to have more. Isn't that kind of fascinating?
It's one of the reasons that fairy tales appeal so much to children, although I think they have a universal appeal. But you'll notice sometimes adults are bothered by fairy tale justice. They don't like the part of the story where Cinderella's stepsisters get their eyes pecked out by birds, mm-hmm. or they don't like the part of the story where Snow White's wicked stepmother has to dance to death in hot iron shoes. But small children, most of the time, really love these kind of difficult consequences. I remember as a child loving the end of the fairy tale The Goose Girl by the Brothers Grimm. And at the end of the story, the false bride, who has taken the place of the true bride, is told the story of what all the evil things she did and asked, what would you do to somebody who did this thing? And she says, oh, I'd put them into a barrel that's studded with nails and have them dragged through the streets till they're dead. And then they're like, aha, you have spoken your own punishment. And that's what is done to her. And I loved that ending. It just felt so just. In the story of Esther in the in the Old Testament, has a really similar parallel story where Haman, who is going who is plotting to put all the Jews to death, asks what should be done.
Or he's asked.
Yeah, he's asked what should be done to somebody who is plotting the death of the queen, and he says, oh, hang him from this high gallows, and then that's what's done to him. He's hung from the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai.
I love also in that same story, earlier in the story, when he's asked what would you do for somebody who deserved the king's greatest honors, and he thinks that the king's talking about him, and so he gives this whole thing about what he thinks should be done, and then
the parade
Mordecai
and where the
is the one who gets paraded through the street as this honorable man, and that just makes Haman so angry. But so it is. In both
we
cases,
have this sense of satisfaction of like, oh, the wicked were punished, and that sets something right in the world.
Right.
But we also recognize our own wickedness. St. Paul says in the New Testament, there is none righteous, no, not one. And we recognize that in ourselves, we all have a sense of how short we fall of perfection. And that gives us a sense that we ought to be punished.
Well, and there's another aspect to this flagellation. Yeah, and that is, we have a false sense of what humility is. And so we feel like, and you'll see people do this not only when they make mistakes, but when they do good things. They'll diminish themselves and think that they're being humble by talking poorly about themselves and saying, I'm not that good. I'm really, and they'll and it's like, that is not humility. Mm-hmm. Humility is recognizing your strengths and attributing them to God, because all good things come from God. So we recognize our strengths and then we attribute that to God. We glorify God in our strengths. If we're only ever saying that we're stupid and we're weak and we're no good, and how are we glorifying God? That is not humility, but we have a false sense of humility in doing this, giving ourselves these consequences. And so, but I have to, we do have to say also, consequences aren't bad. It's not bad to have consequences.
It's actually a good thing. I guess that's what I was trying to say about the justice sense, that it's a good thing that there are consequences.
Right. So here's the thing that's really important. Number one, all consequences need to be directly related to the situation. Mm-hmm. And number two, consequences need to be known in advance. God tells us in advance what will happen to us if we don't obey. Now, you think about the city of Nineveh and Jonah being sent there. God tells them, if you don't repent, you're going to be destroyed. Now, luckily, they did repent, but he told them in advance. He didn't just destroy them.
Yeah, and so frequently when I'm dealing with our children, let's say they're doing something that I don't want them to be doing, but I haven't told them ahead of time, don't do that thing, then I feel like it's incumbent on me to say, okay, here is what the consequence is going to be for this going forward. Where I might want to come in right now and say, hey, I'm going to inflict a consequence to stop this undesirable behavior. Mm-hmm. I need to pause and say, this behavior is not permissible for whatever reason. And going forward from here, the consequence for this behavior will be.
Right. And that's the thing about consequences. Your child needs to know in advance, what will the consequence be if I break this rule? Now, if it's an unspoken rule that you've not told your child and you're assuming that they know the rule, you're wrong. You're wrong. Never assume that your child knows the rule. If you have a rule that and your child says, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that, and you don't have it written down somewhere, or you haven't talked about it directly, then you have to say, I'm sorry you didn't know this was a rule. I'm letting you know now. This is a rule. I'm telling you directly. And this will be the consequence in the future if this happens again. You can't just give them a consequence because they did something that you hadn't already set up as a rule. So those are the two most important rules for consequences, and that should be for yourself too.
Yeah. So let's just, I know you've just gone over the rules for consequences, but let's just kind of codify and state directly what all of the rules for consequences are. So one rule is that consequences for yourself or others need to be set ahead of time, which means that both the desirable or undesirable behavior needs to be clear, as well as what will happen
Right.
if you do or fail to do the thing. Second,
It needs to be directly related to the situation that the consequence is being given for.
third is that it needs to be commensurate with the level of the thing. So a consequence can be too little to reflect the severity of the action, or it can, I think, more commonly be too great, too exaggerated for what is going on. And you know what's interesting, side tangent, if you ask your children to suggest consequences for a specific action, they will almost always suggest a consequence that's way more severe than you would have assigned for that. So there's kind of a natural thing. And then the last rule, I think, is that in addition to not being too great or too small, consequences need to be neither purely physical nor purely emotional. Both of those act as a manipulative or coercive consequence rather than an influential or persuasive consequence.
Right. And there's another rule that I think is really important, actually, that we haven't talked as much about, but I'm going to just give it right now. And that is, when a consequence is being given, whoever is receiving the consequence needs to have the opportunity to give the consequence to themselves first. And only if they reject doing so should somebody else give them the consequence. So, for example, if my child were to break a rule, I should ask my child, okay, what just happened? They're going to explain to me, oh, I broke this rule. Okay, so what do you think needs to happen now? They will already know what the consequence is supposed to be. And most of the time, your child will say, I guess I have to do whatever. They will know, they'll say. Always give the other person, the offender, the opportunity to give themselves the consequence before you give the consequence out. That's it. I think that's an essential rule, because if you're handing out consequences, you're creating an animosity between yourself and the other person, whether it's an employee, whether it's a child, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a,
So as much as possible, we want to be responsible for our own consequences.
Right.
And we should, by the time we're adults, be able to effectively give ourselves consequences to help motivate ourselves. And we want to be teaching our children
to be able to do the same,
to self-regulate.
They need to be able, and if you think about it, that's what's going to build them to that character level that eventually we're trying to get to.
All right, so let's get a homework assignment for this lesson.
Well, I think the homework assignment is to identify the most important rules in your home,
whether for yourself or for your children.
Right. Write them down, and write down the consequence that is appropriate for that rule, if that rule is broken. Write it down, and then share it with everybody that rule is appropriate to share with. So it might be a rule that's just for you, and then you don't need to share it with anybody. It might be a rule that's for the whole household, and then you want to sit down with everybody in the household and go over that rule.
It's possible it's a rule just for yourself, but you want to share it with your spouse, because that sharing will help you to
accountability.
with your accountability.
Yeah. So that's the assignment though. And you should have a minimum of 5 rules that you should be there's at least 5 things in your life, in your home, that you want to, that you know, this is how I want my household to run. So at least 5 rules, and they should be written down with the consequence written beside it, so you know exactly what the consequence is going to be, and that consequence again should be commensurate with and related to the rule.
All right. We'll see you back here for our lesson on desire for rewards.